Without further ado, please allow me to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Raj Bhala is the Brenneson Distinguished Professor at the University of Kansas School of Law. He's a leading scholar of international trade and Islamic law. He's published many books and articles, is the member of many distinguished organizations here in the US and the UK and in India, has won many awards that I don't have time to enumerate here. He received his JD from Harvard Law School and holds master's degrees from Oxford and LSE, and was delighted to learn that he, like me, earned his BA from Duke University, which, like KU, a blue blood basketball school, is somehow becoming a football school this school year. So knock on wood that we both do well. Anyways, I am really delighted that Raj has served as a member on the Trade War Lab Advisory Committee since we were established here at KU, and I really can't think of a better person to kick off this speaker series for the new academic year, because Raj's work really embodies the kind of policy relevant and interdisciplinary scholarship that we're trying to promote with this series. So today, Raj will be presenting on his latest book, Trade War: Causes, Conduct, and Consequences of Sino-American Confrontation. Over to Raj, a virtual round of applause to welcome our speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Zhang, and also Director Audrey. It's just very humbling to be here with you and to speak on such an important topic. I was honored when Professor Zhang asked me to speak this summer, and to have co-sponsors that we do, especially the Dole Institute, is just fabulous. I mean, I remember when I joined KU in 2003, and the Dole Institute was inaugurated by, in a wonderful bipartisan way, by Senator Dole and President Clinton. And those two are instrumental in seeing through NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, and then ultimately onward to China's entry into the WTO. So we couldn't ask for better co-sponsors. I'd like to also thank all of you for joining us, really from around the world, from multiple time zones, including where it's pretty late in India. And I must give a special shout out and thanks to my high school, University School of Milwaukee, and my teachers, including John Stevens, who are joining us today. You know, when we took U.S. intellectual history and advanced placement U.S. history back with Mr. Stevens at University School, we studied Edgar Snow's Red Star over China. And we studied Barbara Tuchman's Stilwell and the American Experience in China. And those kinds of assignments created in me a lifelong love for China, and led to many trips to China. And I can draw a direct line from those high school days to where I'm sitting today, having written a book on the trade war. Well, what I'd like to do is start off with 3 presidential quotes that I think frame this trade war. And then I would like to lay out just straight up what the thesis of the book is, exactly what it argues. And then I'd like to go through 3 of the battlefronts in the trade war: tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and human rights. Now, one disclaimer is that there are 2 topics that we're not going to have time to cover today. And those are the battles over forced labor. So I won't be speaking about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the UFLPA. I've done that in other fora, and we can talk about that maybe in a different opportunity. And I also won't speak about the Section 232 steel and aluminum wars that are still going on. They are very much related to the trade war, but as you can probably tell from their rubrics, they are broader than just US-China bilateral relations. So to begin with 3 presidential quotes. The first is from the White House, from President Biden. The People's Republic of China is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. Now from President Xi Jinping. This country, meaning China, this country is its people, The people are the country. As the Communist Party of China has led the people in fighting to establish and develop the People's Republic, we must foster a firmer sense of purpose, fortitude, and self-belief in the whole party and the Chinese people, so that we cannot be swayed by fallacies, deterred by intimidation, or cowed by pressure. We will stay firmly rooted in Chinese culture, and we will better tell Chinese stories, make China's voice heard, and present a China that is credible, appealing, and respectable. And we will show better the world China's culture. And then finally, from President Kennedy, no country's government is so evil that its people are entirely without virtue. Let me just review those three quotes. The first one from President Biden is telling us that our principal strategic competitor is the People's Republic of China, and that competitor is aiming to reshape the entire global order as we've known it since the end of the Second World War. The presidential quote from President Xi is telling us that this trade war is part of the resurrection of the great Chinese nation after the Opium Wars and the period of spheres of influence at the hands of colonialist powers. And very close to my heart, being an Indian American with a Malaysian Chinese wife, is President Kennedy's statement that no country's government is so evil that its people are entirely without virtue. It's close to my heart because the narrative of this trade war has gotten to a kind of demonization of the other side. And we have felt it on the streets of the United States when some of our leaders in this trade war have framed the war as very personal against the Chinese people. And that is wrong. That is, dare I say, racist. And so I hope as we go forward, not only in this conversation, but more generally during this presidential election season, we see the two oppositional Biden-Xi Jinping characterizations through the calmer lens of President Kennedy. Now, what's the trade war book all about? What's the basic thesis that the book presents? And it's this: America and China are locked in a trade war to which there is no obvious end in sight, the causes of which lie in their different values, the conduct of which extends far beyond commerce, and the consequences of which are dangerous. Now, that thesis uses the term trade war, and the book goes into a definition of trade war borrowing from the Oxford English Dictionary and other sources, because economists, while they have definitions for lots of phenomena, including a recession, they don't have a definition that's established for a trade war. So the book lays that out, and I'll just beg your indulgence and say, bear with me, we are in a trade war by that definition that's in the book. Now, the causes of the trade war. As to its causes, the trade war is about the threat to national security America perceives from China, and about containment of China's reemergence as a global power. Most American officials, regardless of political party, prefer to eschew the word containment and instead use the word competition, or maybe with the adjective strategic competition. China uses the term openly as President Xi did in a speech back in March of 2023, when he basically said Western countries led by the US have implemented all around containment. Now, from the Chinese perspective, that's the cause of the trade war. American efforts to contain, to keep China down. As to the conduct of the trade war, as we'll see, it's fought over tariffs, especially Section 301 tariffs, which I'll explain. A very powerful unilateral weapon the US has used. But like in many wars, theaters of combat expand quickly. Have we not been seeing that with Russia, Ukraine? Well, that's happened in our trade war. We've expanded the battlefronts, the theaters, to non-tariff barriers, to industrial policy, and to human rights. And as to consequences, the consequences resonate around the world in substance and in style. One major consequence is decoupling, which the Europeans prefer to call de-risking, but I think that's a euphemism. Meaning decoupling, reconfiguring of supply chains, onshoring, friendshoring to one degree or another. And another way to put the consequences then is gone is the era in which Adam Smith, David Ricardo, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, respectively. Gone is the era in which their principles of efficiency were the prominent drivers of international trade relations. Forget about it. The prominent driver is no longer this idea of pursue efficiency, and then maybe that will lead, apropos Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his Secretary of State Cordell Hull, to greater cross-cultural understanding, a kind of peace through trade. Forget about it. What drives trade policy are national security concerns, and thus what we see in the consequences of this trade war are changing of supply chains. The name of the game for the US is to protect its supply chains and disrupt China's. And the name of the game for China is to do vice versa. Think of the game as hardening one's air defenses while bombing the enemy. That's kind of what trade has become about. Now, that thesis laid out, let me try and explain the three battlefronts, the tariff, non-tariff barrier, and human rights battlefronts. But before I do, let me just take a little bit of historical detour and explain the very origins of the trade war. I mentioned the history that I had gotten to study, that I was privileged to study in high school and beyond. The origins of this trade war are not with the Trump administration. They're not with the Biden administration. They date much further back. And they date back even to 1986, when China lodged its application to join the WTO. Now, here's the bottom line point of the history that I'll quickly cover. The origins of the trade war are in false hope of China's joining the WTO, which it did on the 11th of December, 2001. False hope, false expectations. Now, to explain that briefly, the history is this. The modern multilateral trading system is founded on the 30th of October, 1947, with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. And GATT is the constitution of trade all the way until the 1st of January, 1995, when the World Trade Organization is born. China, along with the US, and for that matter, along with India and Pakistan, was one of the 23 original contracting parties to the GATT in 1947. But what China was the signatory? It was the China governed by the nationalists, that is the Kuomintang under General Chiang Kai-shek. China run by the nationalists that China lost the Civil War, and the Kuomintang fled to Formosa, to Taiwan. And on the 1st of October 1949, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Chairman Mao Zedong, hoists the red flag over Tiananmen Square. Now, in a fascinating tidbit of trade history, in October 1950, 3 years after China has joined this new post-Second World War modern multilateral trading system, a telex is sent from Taiwan to the GATT Secretariat in Geneva, the headquarters of GATT. And the telex says China is withdrawing from GATT. Mao's government, in control of the mainland, did not pay much attention to the withdrawal that purported to cover both the mainland and Taiwan. The Communist Party had little interest in being part of a capitalist trading system. And the Kuomintang in Taiwan were worried that if China got most favored nation treatment to all the other GATT members, then Chinese industries on the mainland would outcompete industries in Taiwan. Ironically, it turned out exactly the opposite, an irony of history. So China, as in mainland China, was out of the GATT, and so was Taiwan. That would remain true until the 11th of December 2001, when China joins the WTO, and Taiwan does 1 month later on the 11th of January 2002. So in the subsequent half century, the 50s till the 70s, autarky, no trade, is China's, as in mainland China's, trade policy, other than trade with the socialist bloc, especially until the Sino-Soviet split in 1961. With communist countries like North Korea, trade was largely not of great interest to the CCP. Advance the slide of history a little bit more, and what we see after the disastrous consequences of the Cultural Revolution and the death of Chairman Mao in 1976 is a normalization of relations, ultimately under the Taiwan Relations Act in the Carter administration. Now, of course, that's preceded, you sinologists will know, by the Shanghai Communique that President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger arranged in February of '72. By 1978-79, the pragmatic leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, with catchphrases like reform is China's second revolution. It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. China starts opening up with special economic zones, and in 1986, China finally joins or applies to join the GATT. All of the GATT negotiators, including the American team, was very aware of the history, and right away rejected China's argument that we never really withdrew because it was the nationalists who sent the telex from Taiwan. They didn't cover us. Thus began 13 years of tortuous negotiations between principally the Americans and the Chinese on China's terms of entry into the WTO, into the club. Now, one aside, sort of a legal, if not social tip, it's always better to be in a club when the club is writing the rules, because then you get to write the rules too. China was outside the club, so China had to take the rules as written by the GATT and WTO members. Well, the terms of entry that were negotiated by the administration of President Bill Clinton, and one person I greatly admire, the Chinese Premier Zhu Rongji, were breathtaking. They were breathtaking because the Chinese agreed to broad, deep commitments to open the Chinese economy to foreign goods and services, protect intellectual property rights, and subject itself to the new dispute settlement system of the World Trade Organization. To give you just a simple example, China committed to slash its auto tariffs from 100% to 25%. and to allow foreign auto financiers to lend to Chinese customers to buy cars. It's not enough just to get the cars in the Chinese market, as Americans long had wanted to do since the 1920s. But you also got to make it financially viable for Chinese customers to pay the sticker price. And so GMAC, along with GM, can now go into China. Now, why did China make those breathtaking commitments? Because Premier Zhu Rongji said the Chinese people could, to use the Anglicization English term of the Chinese saying, they could eat bitterness. They could suffer competition from overseas because of their culture of hard work and entrepreneurship. They would succeed with that hard work and entrepreneurship as against foreign competition. And poverty would be alleviated further, job opportunities would increase for millions of Chinese citizens in export industries. Now, China never committed to become a Western-style, multi-candidate, multi-party democracy. The Chinese Communist Party never committed to become a Euro-communist party. China never pledged an American-style Bill of Rights, nor did China need to do that. There are no political or civil rights criteria necessary, no human rights criteria necessary to join the World Trade Organization. Another case in point, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia joined the WTO in 2005. But amidst the euphoria of the post-Cold War Washington consensus in favor of free and open trade, it was widely expected, reasonably expected, in China as well as across America and around the world, that China's economic liberalization, its commercial law reforms that it had to engage in because of being a WTO member, would extend to some degree into the political realm. It would be a kind of capitalism with socialist characteristics, inching towards a liberalism that would illustrate Milton Friedman's proposition in his 1962 classic, Capitalism and Freedom, that economic freedom is somewhat of a precondition for political freedom, and one eventually leads to the other. So simply put, when China joined the WTO, the expectation was domination by the CCP autocracy ultimately would become incompatible with China's desire to match the US economically, because openness to trade would lead to tolerance in government. That expectation has been dashed economically and politically. And so that's why I suggest in the book, the origins of today's Sino-American trade war lie in disappointed economic expectations and political expectations. First, in an economic sense, China simply has not met all of its WTO commitments. Other WTO members, including the US, of course, feel that China has failed to play by WTO rules. To give you one simple example, China pledged to give foreign bank licenses, that foreign banks, the licenses like Citibank, to do business across the mainland, not just on the Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou corridor, but everywhere, north, south, east, west, in local currency, take deposits, make loans, etc. China dragged its feet on that commitment and discriminated in favor of its own banks. Another example, China discriminated in favor of its own credit card and payment system providers against MasterCard and Visa. Well, the American side didn't exactly nail down those commitments in writing. They accepted Chinese promises. So what did the US do as it got mounting evidence of China not playing by the rules? Hence the creeping trade war. First, dialogue. President George W. Bush said, let's have strategic dialogue with China. Bilateral. Let's try and solve these problems. Didn't work. even on key issues of currency manipulation, which we'll probably talk about. The Obama administration pursues a litigation strategy and says, look, how about we litigate with China under the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement mechanism? And indeed, the US brings lots of cases and wins lots of cases. But neither the dialogue nor the litigation strategy solved the problem of disappointed expectations and compelling China to, through American eyes, meet all of its international legal obligations under the WTO. And that's not surprising because litigation is episodic. It's a problem by problem approach. But the big problem with China was systemic. It was across the Chinese economy. It had not, for example, privatized state-owned enterprises. Instead, it would continue to subsidize them. And there was a second problem. The new Chinese leadership, particularly when President Xi Jinping comes to power, is more nationalistic, more insistent on the great renewal of the Chinese nation, and looking at China's re-entry into the world trading system as a chance to change what had happened before with the unequal treaties during the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842. And a third reason litigation and dialogue didn't work to snip this trade war in the bud was China had big ambitions. Overseas, power, and at home, unity. So overseas, reunification with Taiwan by force if necessary, God forbid, and across the South China Sea, assert sovereignty across the 9-dash line. And internally, to Tibetan Buddhists, to Uyghur Muslims, behave, know your place under the CCP. So enter candidate Donald J. Trump. The facts he seized on were that most of the job losses and income erosion were due to that America in its industrial heartland, about 1 to 2 million, had experienced across the 20-year period from 2001 up through 15-year period to 2015 were due to China. So it was time for America first, right? So that disappointed expectations, you can just draw a line to America first. So the trade war is launched under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, a Nixon-era statute that was designed by Congress at the time to give President Nixon a unilateral weapon at the time to deal with the Soviet Union. Now we use it against China. The US Trade Representative faults China for acts, policies, or practices, that's the language of the statute, that are arbitrary, unjustifiable, or discriminate against US trade and burden US commerce. And in March 2018, the US Trade Representative, the USTR, publishes the results of the investigation, giving the president all the justification he needs to change US strategy toward China from litigation and dialogue to remedy, to a weapons-based kind of remedy. Now, what are those acts, policies, and practices in the 215-page, dare I say, very well documented, thoroughly footnoted report? Forced technology transfer. If you want a joint venture in China, American company, let's take John Deere or Caterpillar, then you've got to share your technology or your trade secrets with your Chinese joint venture partner. A second act, policy, or practice is that if you want to invest or acquire a US company and you're a Chinese acquirer, the target is the US company, then transfer from the target US company is forcibly transferred over to the Chinese parent. A third act, policy, or practice is cyber theft, outright sensitive commercial information and trade secrets being stolen from the Chinese, by the Chinese. And then we have two follow-up reports from the US Trade Representative and the White House Technology and Trade Office. And they elaborate and they point out, hey, it's a lot worse than just what we thought. It's also industrial policy like the Made in China 2025 policy. So if you've been following the recent scuffle over Huawei getting 7-nanometer chips, advanced chips, and Apple iPhone being basically banned in China among government officials at central and some local governments and state-owned enterprises, you'll know exactly what I'm about to say. The Made in China industrial policy specifically targets for the Chinese domestic market 80% market share for Chinese mobile communications. And for world market share, for example, on integrated circuits, the chips, 56% by 2025. And so the White House and the USTR are saying, wow, we are now confronting something that's typically been a pejorative term if it's used in the US, industrial policy on a grand scale. So what's the result? Battlefront number one, tariffs. The tariff, as you know, is a tax at the border imposed on merchandise by US Customs and Border Protection, CBP. It's imposed on merchandise that originates or is made in China. Well, here are the 4 waves of tariffs that the US has imposed. In July of 2018, 25% on $34 billion worth of Chinese agricultural products. In August 2018, 25% wave 2 tariffs, $16 billion worth of Chinese, again, ag-related products. About a year later, about a month later, September 2018, wave 3 tariffs, up to 25% on $200 billion worth of Chinese ag and industrial goods. So now you're looking at 34 plus 16 plus 200, $250 billion worth, which is almost getting close to half of what the US imports from China, are now being tariffed at 25%. Finally, in October 2019, we get what's called Wave 4, which is divided into List A and List B, 7.5% tariffs on another $120 billion worth of products. So today, to this day, we are at about 2/3 to 3/4 of all Chinese tariffs, Chinese merchandise is tariffed at about 25%, with some at 7.5%. Why not the last little bit, if you will? Because they would be largely consumer products that might really hurt lower and middle income Americans. And we are again going into a presidential election year. Now, what's been the Chinese response to these tariffs? Because, war often is de-escalated or escalated at early moments in a battle. Well, the Chinese response has been to escalate, tit for tat. In every instance in which the Americans imposed tariffs, the Chinese did so basically on the same value of American imports into China. They would impose tariffs, and when China ran out of American products to hit with tariffs, because we don't ship as many goods to China as they do to us, we have a bilateral trade deficit. China then upped the tariffs on some American products, and failing that, imposed non-tariff barriers. Like if you need a license to import a product in China, well, you can get that license on Friday afternoon between 4 and 5 o'clock at one port dock in Shanghai. So you drag your feet on giving licenses. Now, the theory all along, if you think back to the Cold War, it's always been this rational calculation theory that, yeah, the Chinese would understand if the Americans slowly upped the pressure on tariffs, the Chinese would eventually feel enough pain and realize it was not worth blowing up the system that they had entered into just recently, the WTO, and were getting most favored nation treatment, they would back down. Not so in this new nationalistic, let's look at the future through the lens of the treaties of humiliation. So it was always tit for tat retaliation. That's one battlefront. Second battlefront are non-tariff barriers. Now, when we say non-tariff barrier, we mean any imposition of an impediment to trade that is it can be at the border like a quota, or it can be after the border. And there are many examples of non-tariff barriers. We'll just have time to go through one or maybe two. And I'd like to focus on semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment and the 2022 United States CHIPS Act. So the CHIPS battlefront, if you will, or the CHIPS wars. What's happened with the CHIPS wars is we're seeing a strong emphasis by the American side on restricting the ability of China to get advanced chips which are defined as chips with a circumference of 14 or 16 nanometers or less. The smaller the chip, the more powerful it is, the more data transfer it can accommodate, and the faster it works. Apple iPhones currently work on about a 4 nanometer chip. The iPhone 15 that was just revealed today at a very expensive price, was it going to be $11.99 for the iPhone 15, the high-end one? That's a 3 nanometer chip. Now, what the Americans don't want to see is China get those chips and then use them in advanced fighter jets, which are clearly military equipment, or laptops, which are dual civilian military use. In other words, the idea is to thwart the industrial policy, the Made in China 2025, on advanced technology and AI. So what do? We adopt our own American-style industrial policy. One of the ironies of war is sort of like you can't beat them, join them, right? So $75 billion in subsidies are offered to companies, foreign or domestic, that invest in chip facilities in the United States. No money available if you invest in a country of concern, and which are they? China, North Korea, Russia. In addition, a 25% tax credit for investments if you invest in a chip facility. So that's just one of several non-tariff barrier battlefronts. I'll give you another one quickly before kind of moving to a conclusion here on how do we characterize this trade war. And that's on Chinese military industrial complex companies, CMICs. The very term military industrial complex is one that comes out of, as you know, President Eisenhower's farewell address in 1960. And he's applying it to the United States. And here we're using it. It's the Chinese who have the military industrial complex. And basically, President Biden's 2021 executive order is targeting investments in these CMECs. Basically, you cannot invest, United States persons cannot invest in CMICs, which are companies that operate in or on behalf of China's defense or surveillance industry. And those rules are policed by the Treasury Department, by the Office of Foreign Assets Controls. All right, now, let's turn to very quickly that third battlefront, China and Hong Kong and human rights, very quickly, and then wrap up. This is where the trade war has really expanded even further. China enacted the national security law in basically July of 2020, June 30th, July 1st of 2020. And what that national security law does is it criminalizes with potential life imprisonment sedition, subversion, terrorism, or foreign interference. Those are Articles 20 through 29 of China's national security law. Despite the rubric of the law, it's all about human rights, because the key terms in the law, secession, sedition, terrorism, foreign interference, are ambiguously defined. And so prosecutorial discretion has been used, not surprisingly with ambiguous terms, to focus on unrest in Hong Kong that is not acceptable to the Chinese Communist Party, and indeed even to revise curriculum in primary, secondary, and tertiary schools. Now, the national security law has also proved to be a precursor to purge the Legislative Council of Hong Kong, Hong Kong's legislature, to make sure that only Chinese patriots can participate in LegCo elections and be a member of LegCo. And we've also seen, in effect, a purging of foreign legal counsel in Hong Kong to represent defendants under the national security law, and the sitting judges of the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal, its Supreme Court, some of whom used to be British or from other countries, they have basically been said, you're really not wanted here. So what did the U.S. do? Secretary of State Mike Pompeo certified that China and Hong Kong, it's no longer one country, two systems. It's one country, one system. No longer can you have a made in Hong Kong label. Any product that is coming from Hong Kong is coming from China. There is no special trade status for Hong Kong anymore. So all those Section 301 tariffs that apply to Chinese merchandise will apply to Hong Kong merchandise. All right, now let's wrap it up with, what does all this mean? I mean, you know, I laid out a thesis for you about the long-term, no end in sight nature of the conflict. But what I didn't do is, how do you characterize what's happening? How do you characterize this reality? Ultimately, it's for each of us to decide, but I'll give you three. The first characterization, it's a Cold War. Now, thankfully, it's not yet turned violent, but we already know it's a proxy Cold War in some degree in Ukraine and in North Korea. It's not a perfect analogy because the Soviets and Americans never traded very much with one another during the first Cold War, whereas China and the US did. But it is an apt label if you believe that what is going on is an underlying ideological schism, with China wanting to avenge an inglorious past humiliated by Western imperialists, and the Western so-called imperialists are presenting an alternative model of free trade and political liberalism. That's characterization one. Characterization two, Thucydides trap. Thucydides, as you know, is the author of the Peloponnesian War. He lived in the 5th century BC. And his idea is this war, well, to apply his idea, this war is about two powers on two different trajectories. One is trying to displace the other. America's like ancient Sparta. It's a power in decline. It's still immovable, but it's trying to hang on to its post-Second World War global dominance. But its internal divisions have rendered it weak, vulnerable, challenged by a new rival, China. China, like ancient Athens, though not a democracy, obviously, is the irresistible rising power with a strong unified leadership and a shared vision for its place in the world. Now, that characterization, I'll just say personally, you know, as someone who, you know, is here as the US, who is, you know, an American and a dual citizen with Canada. I was born in Toronto. and many of my family migrated from Malaysia, from Canada, from India. We are not, well, let's just say we actively debate at our dinner table declinism, because the Thucydides trap idea or characterization presumes America's in decline. And I'm usually the one around the family dining table that is saying, no, we're not a power in decline. But that's a conversation, we can have. Here's the third and final characterization, then we'll definitely do questions and comments. Open versus authoritarian societies. That this trade war is about open versus authoritarian societies. The Biden administration likes this characterization, though it really originated during the Trump administration with famed investor and philanthropist George Soros. He was giving a talk in January 2019 at the Davos Forum. He's a student of Karl Popper. Karl Popper at the London School of Economics. Karl Popper writes a critique of Plato called The Open Society and Its Enemies. Soros applies the idea of his teacher, Karl Popper, open society, and says that's the US, and the enemies of the authoritarian regime is China. So you've got a decentralized system where the individual is the center, free to trade, free to vote, free to worship, free to protest. That's the open society. And through self-interested individual pursuits, the common good is advanced. Now, that wouldn't be Plato's idea, right? Through the centralized system of philosopher king, the first system is decaying under its own weight. It's tearing itself apart with radical freedom. And we need resolute guidance of the philosopher king, the Chinese Communist Party, responsible at the top. It will rid China of the scourges of poverty and inequality and address corruption. So there it is. 3 characterizations of a trade war that is ongoing with no end in sight, a forever trade war that's being fought on 3 battlefronts. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Raj, for great, really insightful, comprehensive presentation, and really looking forward to assigning the book in my classes, and hope audience members can consider buying a copy and doing the same. So again, encourage folks to put questions into the Q&A, and I want to kick off, use my moderator privilege here and kick off with a few questions motivated by the presentation. So you just characterized the new reality of the trade war, Raj, as these 3 versions of, I would call all 3 versions are really clash of systems, right? New trade war, Thucydides trap, open versus closed societies in this forever trade war. But you also hinted at, in your presentation, right, at things, movements within the US, like adopting industrial policy, like what you said, can't beat them, join them, in ways in which the United States may be not diverging, right, and differentiating itself from China, but actually adopting aspects, right, of the things that we stand against to including, for example, greater scrutiny, as you opened up your talk, right, greater sort of scrutiny towards Chinese Americans, for example. So how do you square those 2 things, right? As the US is and China, if they're engaged in this ideological sort of contest, right, but they're also in policy behavior becoming more like each other, how do we characterize that dynamic in this new reality?
Yeah, great question. I guess the starting point, let me put my sort of international lawyer hat on, and we're international lawyers are supposed to solve problems, not exacerbate them. And I think one of the ways we solve problems is with a sense of empathy and with a sense of humility. And I think, and we can almost laugh at ourselves a little bit if we're and be a little bit more humble. We in the U.S. ought to appreciate that there are virtues to industrial policy, and that there are different kinds of industrial policy. The Chinese style of industrial policy is across all sectors and embraces, of course, state-owned enterprises that we don't have. Indian style industrial policy with Prime Minister Modi and Make in India favors some of the titans of Indian industry that have been around since the partition. US style industrial policy isn't exactly across all sectors. It uses tools of tax incentives and subsidies with lots of conditions and guardrails. And it relies on sometimes public-private partnerships. But in no case is industrial policy a bad word. They're all designed to enhance the GDP, the per capita GDP of the country, to stimulate growth, and hopefully to reduce Gini coefficients and other measures of income inequality that we've seen in all three countries. In fact, China's is now worse than India's, or has been for a while. So I guess I would start with a point of let's just poke a little fun of ourselves and be humble that, you know, to say we adopt industrial policies, not to say we are like China or the former Soviet Union. And then I think a second sense is to build on that and to say, well, seeing that we've learned a bit from you, you've learned a bit from us, now we need to take the next step and solve some common problems. And let's do it sector by sector. And one of the most important, or two of the most important sectors to solve those problems are going to be steel and aluminum. Because industrial policy has resulted, not only in China, but in some surprising places like Iran, some parts of the Middle East, in tremendous overcapacity in the steel and aluminum sectors. And through bilateral negotiations, possibly through the OECD, we can come to some agreement on what is reasonable industrial policy without completely torquing, or I should say disjointing world markets. And then from there, a green steel deal, which the US and the EU are now working on, but they're excluding China from it. And there's really no resolution to green steel or climate change without China.
Thanks, Raj. Turning next to a question from the audience from Matt. This question is, do you feel that Chinese approach to world trade is broadly mercantilist? Another of these bad words. And I'd like to add to Matt's question and note that, in reading Lighthizer book, right, he has many criticisms of Chinese mercantilism, but also is calling for American mercantilism. So talk about sort of how do you view the return to mercantilism, if you will?
Officials who've worked in the United States Trade Representative's office, Ambassador Lighthizer's office, before him, have said, we are all free traders. These are American officials. We are all free traders until we get to the bargaining table, and then we become mercantilists. That is the truth, in the sense that by mercantilism, we mean, broadly speaking, maximizing your exports in order to maximize your export revenues, in order to plug those export revenues into your military to safeguard the sea lanes, protect your national security, and of course, minimize imports so as to minimize outflows. In the days of mercantilism, in the classic sense, gold and precious metals flowing out from Britain to other countries. So absolutely, the doctrine of free trade falls to mercantilism when modern day trade negotiators get to the bargaining table. And that's why in our trade law class and in the trade law textbook, the proposition that we often discuss is there is no such thing as free trade. All trade is managed. We always manage flows and values, and we protect sensitive sectors. I mean, after all, historically, about the only time we've seen unilateral disarmament of trade and non-tariff barriers were in England in the mid-late 1800s with the dismantling of the Corn Laws. Really, ever since then, trade deals have been reciprocal about a give and take of what kind of market access can we grant. But I dare say here again, international lawyers are good problem solvers, because the choice really is not between free trade and mercantilism. It really is shades of managed trade. And the way we trade lawyers manage trade are through transition rules. If we say, look, we cannot open up our steel sector immediately with no duties and no quotas, what we can do is open it up to foreign competition over a 5 or 10 or 15-year period. And in fact, NAFTA took 15 years, NAFTA 1.0, to finally be implemented fully. The US-Morocco Free Trade Agreement has some sectors that are protected for going on 20 or 23 years. Similarly, I think with US-Australia. So we can skillfully manage trade to gradually liberalize it and move it away from mercantilism.
Thank you, Raj. I'm going to let you read. There's a long question here from an audience member. I'm going to skip that and ask a question that combines kind of our final question from the audience, and then we'll return to this if you have any comments. But my question is, we have to ask, right, who's winning, right? After 5 years, when I started the lab, right, people were like, what if the trade war is over? Like, then you have this lab that studies nothing. But you know, I guess thankfully for us and sad for the world, right, trade war is going, as you point out, tariffs are going strong after all this time. And, you know, who's winning? Which government think that they're winning? And more importantly, I think, based on sort of the work that my lab does, right, who is paying the costs in the interim, right? Who is dying in the trenches right now in this forever war? Or is it actually costless? Like, you know, yeah. And you know, and Grant's question is really, right, what would the world look like without the trade war? What, you know, what would peace look like? Thank you.
Good and a great and difficult question. Well, the question itself puts paid the comment that had been made by the previous president that trade wars are easy to win. They're not. I don't think there are any outright winners or losers from this trade war. There are certain times and certain constituencies that have won certain battles. Now, think broadly. What by constituencies we mean the governments of the two sides, we mean producers, and we mean consumers. Generally, consumers have tended to lose insofar as they've paid higher prices. But producers who have been supplying substitute goods, say from Vietnam, have been winners. Some domestic producers of goods that were competing with China have now gained from the tariff protections, but their consumers have again lost through downstream higher costs. In terms of the governments, I think both have suffered a lot of reputational damage. And look at it from an Indian perspective or a South African perspective. You know, the African Union was just admitted to the G20. You know, most of the world does not want to get caught up in a Sino-American trade war that's endless. They want to do business with both sides. You see that even with Vietnam. You certainly see it with India. And so, in a way, the G20 has, under Prime Minister Modi's leadership, has become a kind of new non-aligned movement. So, because I think he's seeing a sense that nobody's going to win by picking sides here. And we all want to engage in a kind of shared prosperity. I will say one thing, and this is not to say the Chinese government are the bigger losers, but there was a comment by a Chinese citizen in Bloomberg, or one of the major reports, that are saying confidence in the Chinese government is increasingly becoming a question of confidence in the Chinese economy is increasingly becoming a question of confidence in the Chinese government. And what I think he meant by saying that is the Chinese economy is in trouble, and President Biden pointed that out. Even, I don't want to say it was taunting, but saying he doesn't think they could mount an invasion, God forbid, a cross-border with China. And what the point was, the trade war has caused suffering in China, manufacturing decline, job loss, industrial unrest. And that trade war has been coupled with a very severe COVID shutdown for several years in China. It's also been coupled with a rather unskillful clamp down on Chinese entrepreneurs, from Jack Ma to whoever, you name it. And whatever the motives were in terms of anti-corruption, if you clamp down enough on entrepreneurs, you discourage entrepreneurship. So I think the Chinese government is calling into question its ability to be a good steward of its economy and meet its long-standing, since 1949, pledge with the Chinese people that will take care of the politics, leave the politics to us, as long as you do what you're supposed to do economically in the framework we set up. Well, the framework that has been set up now is in crisis, and the political wisdom is being challenged. And I don't think you're seeing that on the American side, because there is tremendous bipartisan consensus in favor of continuing this Sino-American trade war. If there's one thing we're going to see in the presidential campaign, it'll be candidates outdoing themselves to show how tough they are on China.
It's a good transition to our last question here, just on the different leadership styles, I guess, or emphasis between righteousness and interest, Yi and Li. Do you have any views on this point, and then we'll close?
So I did a piece for our law and literature, in the law and literature side on Shakespeare and Othello and Iago and his style. And I think some American officials, some American administrations have been negative, to say the least, and have unleashed some rather evil sentiments through their rhetoric. And that rhetoric has been deployed not only against China, but even against some of our closest allies, Canada and the European Union. That's not skillful. So with the Biden administration, I think we've seen a difference in style, but not in substance of trade policy. On the Chinese side, I think they've had an opportunity to take the high road in their rhetoric and not match some of the lower level pronouncements that have come out of Washington. That's not always happened. Sometimes you get, depending on which official or which publication you're reading, something that sounds like it's from the 1950s and the old Cold War. Other times you get something that is a little bit more United Nations statesman-like sounding. And if maybe both sides would do well to remember that rhetoric is often the precursor to war or peace. And so toning down the rhetoric would help a lot.
It's a really good point. I'd also just, if I could add one more thing on this, is that I think both governments also feel that they're on the side of righteousness and that they have interests sort of at stake, right? But the difference in rhetoric is so much.